The Maryland Department of Health, Developmental Disabilities Administration, Self-Directed Services Training Series, Module 9, Self-Directed Services Forms, updated February 18th, 2025. This training module will provide you with an overview of self-directed services forms. This training is a summary with important information on this topic. More information and requirements are found in the Medicaid Waiver Program applications, laws, regulations, guidance, and policies. The most updated information regarding self-directed services is published in the Self-Directed Services Policy and Manual that can be found on the DDA's website. Under the Self-Directed Services model, there are specific self-directed services forms required to be submitted with the person-centered plan and when changes or updates are made. They include the Rights and Responsibilities form, which is required for both the self-directed services and traditional service delivery models, the Participant Agreement form, and the Family as Staff form. These required forms were first mentioned in the Person-Centered Planning training module. We will go into more detail during this training module. Rights and Responsibilities form. Everyone who receives services from the DDA has both rights and responsibilities. It is important that the participant understand their rights. It is also important that they understand their responsibilities. The DDA-funded Services Participant Rights and Responsibilities form is a required document with the Person-Centered Plan for both the self-directed services and traditional service delivery models. The form is intended to notify participants of their rights and responsibilities. It includes information related to general rights and responsibilities, quality assurance, self-directed services budget authority, and self-directed services employer authority. Self-directed services include additional rights and responsibilities for the participant. Budget authority responsibilities include choosing how the budget is spent based on the services and funding approved by the DDA in the Person-Centered Plan and Self-Directed Services budget sheet, including moving funds among approved DDA services to address changing needs, determining the amount paid for services in accordance with funding authorized by DDA and reasonable and customary standards required by the DDA, hiring employees, vendors, and providers of goods and services, so long as they meet qualifications as confirmed by the financial management and counseling services provider. Changing who provides the good and service, so long as the employee, vendor, and provider meets the applicable qualifications. Scheduling the provision of services. Specifying any additional qualifications for employees, vendors, and providers of services beyond the minimum qualifications required by the DDA. And reviewing and approving employee, vendors, and providers invoices or timesheets for actual services rendered and to prevent Medicaid fraud. Budget authority responsibilities also include all expenditure of Medicaid waiver funding must be in accordance with the approved person-centered plan and self-directed services budget sheet and meet program requirements. Budget authority also includes the responsibility to not exceed the amounts allocated in the self-directed services budget sheet during the year, including all costs for employee wages, taxes, workers' compensation, insurance fees, and any legally required paid leave. Complying with all requirements to keep accurate notes, promptly completing payroll, verifying accuracy of timesheets and invoices, signing time cards, and completing tax documents. The responsibility for documentation to support a timesheet claim for payment, including but not limited to timesheets and invoices that are verified as true and correct, and Submitting claims for payment for goods and services authorized by the DDA that were actually provided. The DDA, the Maryland Medicaid Program, and other agencies responsible for overseeing taxpayer funds have the right to review all records related to services demonstrating the DDA waiver program funding requested and the goods and services were actually received. Self-directed services employer authority includes compliance with applicable employment laws, decision-making authority over individual direct support staff who are to provide the DDA waiver program services in accordance with applicable employment laws and DDA waiver program requirements, including recruiting and selecting staff for employment, hiring, managing, and terminating staff from employment, verifying staff qualifications, including obtaining a criminal history and/or background check investigation, provided that the financial management and counseling services provider must confirm independently that the potential staff person meets minimum qualifications to receive funding for services from DDA waiver program, determining staff duties in accordance with the DDA operated waiver program's requirements for the services, determining staff wages and benefits subject to funding approved by the DDA and other DDA requirements, scheduling staff, orienting and instructing staff in their duties, supervising staff, evaluating staff performance, and verifying time worked by staff and approving timesheets. Employer authority also includes responsibilities for submitting claims for payment on behalf of staff to the financial management and counseling services provider, establishing a backup plan to ensure health and safety in case staff is not able to work, choice or requirement to hire a support broker to provide employer-related coaching and mentoring, responsibilities for ensuring that the choices made in managing services under the self-directed services delivery model do not negatively impact health, safety, or welfare, and responsibilities to keep accurate records of all services and goods received which are funded by the DDA-operated Medicaid waiver program for up to 6 years from the date received. The Self-Directed Services Participant Agreement documents both the participants' request for assistance in self-directing their services and the team members' agreement to assist and support with the specific work or tasks described in the agreement. The agreement begins and lasts for 12 months or up to 1 calendar year from the date of last signature by the participant and all team members named in the document. The agreement may be ended at any time by the participant along with their team. The participant or their team must provide written notice to the participant's coordinator of community services and team members if the agreement is ended. The participant must meet all of the requirements as listed in the agreement. The agreement includes the listing of all members of the participant's person-centered planning team and their roles as shown in this slide. The coordinator of community services must assist the participant and their team to complete the agreement per the participant's preferences and best interest. The coordinator of community services must assist the participant and their team to update the agreement if any changes are requested by the participant or their team members. The coordinator of community services must review the document with the participant on a quarterly basis to make sure that the team members are those that the participant chooses, and to confirm that each team member's agreement to assist and support the participant as stated in the document is current. The coordinator of community services must make sure that the participant's team roles and responsibilities do not conflict with program requirements and rules. The participant and their team members, as applicable, must review the document completely before they sign it. The participant and each team member, as applicable, must sign the last page, and the participant's name should be listed on page 3 of the agreement. A participant or their designated representative may authorize individuals to contact their financial management and counseling services provider by phone or email on the participant's behalf. This authorization is documented in the participant agreement in a new designated section. When another individual is authorized to contact the financial management and counseling services provider on the participant's behalf, the participant or their designated representative may be, but does not need to be, on the phone call. The participant, their designated representative as applicable, and their coordinator of community services must be copied on all emails to the financial management and counseling services provider. This authorization may be used regardless of whether option 1, 2, or 3 is selected in the participant agreement. These authorized individuals may not make decisions about the participant's services or supports, but may discuss issues and address questions with the financial management and counseling services provider. The information must be shared with the participant, their designated representative as applicable, and their coordinator of community services. When this authorization is granted, the coordinator of community services must email a copy of the participant agreement to the participant's financial management and counseling services provider, in addition to uploading the document to LTSS Maryland. The participant agreement signature section includes required signatures. Signing the participant agreement acknowledges that the document has been reviewed and the signer agrees to its contents. All team members mentioned must sign the agreement too. Family as staff. Participants can hire a family member as an employee. Family members are defined in the approved Medicaid waiver programs as relatives. Relative is defined as a natural or adoptive parent, step-parent, child, stepchild, or sibling. Relatives can be hired as employees for the following services: community development services, employment services, day-to-day administrator, nursing support services, only due to extraordinary circumstances, personal supports, respite care services, support broker services, and transportation. To hire a relative, the participant must show all of the following are true. It is their choice and is supported by their team. There is a lack of qualified staff to meet the participant's needs. The family member will help increase the participant's independence, community participation, integration, and belonging, and the family member agrees to implement the participant's person-centered plan and provide services as required by the federal and state rules, laws, and regulations for the DDA-operated Medicaid waiver programs. The DDA Self-Directed Services Family as Staff form is used by all participants who are self-directing. Participants use it to inform their team, coordinator of community services, financial management and counseling services provider, and the DDA if they are hiring a relative to provide an approved Medicaid waiver service. The form is required even if the participant is choosing to not hire a relative. The DDA Self-Directed Services Family as Staff form must be submitted in LTSS Maryland with the person-centered plan, including an initial person-centered plan, a revised person-centered plan, and annual person-centered plan. The DDA Self-Directed Services Family as Staff form must also be submitted when there is a change in information noted on the form. If a relative is hired as support broker, no other relatives may be hired as staff. Support broker services are required when a relative, legally responsible individual, representative payee, or guardian serves as paid staff to assure proper oversight and quality assurance, as well as reduce conflicts of interest. It is also important to note that relatives cannot work over 40 hours per week unless otherwise authorized by the DDA. In order to be cleared to work by the financial management and counseling services provider and receive payment for services, all employees of participants who self-direct must meet all qualification requirements as listed in the DDA-operated Medicaid waiver program and guidance. This includes relatives, legally responsible persons, and legal guardians. Criminal background checks are required for any employee who works for someone who self-directs. First aid and cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, certification are required for all employees who work for someone who self-directs. Both the first aid and CPR training must include hands-on in-person components. The participant self-directing may require any other staff training as desired. The financial management and counseling services provider cannot pay for services rendered by an employee who does not meet all the requirements. The Family of Staff Form, Section 1. Section 1, My Family as Staff Choice in the Family of Staff Form includes the options and participants' choices. Option 1 is selected when the participant does not want to hire a relative. Option 2 is selected when the participant wants to hire a relative to be their support broker. And option 3 is selected when the participant wants to hire a relative or relatives to be their direct support staff. The Family as Staff Form, Section 2. If options 2 or 3 are chosen, Section 2 of the Family as Staff Form must be completed, including listing the name of each family member, listing their relationship to the participant, listing the Medicaid waiver service they are providing, listing their rate of pay, which must be within the DDA's reasonable and customary standards, listing the number of hours per week they will work, up to 40 hours unless authorized by the DDA, describing why hiring the people listed in the participants is in the participant's best interest, describing why hiring the people listed is in the participant's best interest, describing how having a family member as staff will help the participant to be more integrated in their community, describing how having a family member as staff will increase the participant's independence, describing how having a family member as staff will expand the participant's circle of support or natural supports, and describing any special circumstances. The Family of Staff Form Attestation. The participant and applicable team members must sign the form. Before signing the form, it is important to review all information to see that it is correct. The form requires an attestation, which means the participant agrees with the information and it is correct. The participant must sign the form. A legal guardian, if applicable, may sign the form. And the participant's designated representative must sign the form, if applicable. The Coordinator of Community Services must upload the Family of Staff form into LTSS, Financial Management and Counseling Services client attachments, within the person-centered plan. It is important to note that spouses cannot serve as staff with the exception of support broker services. A spouse can provide support broker services but cannot be paid for the service by the Medicaid waiver program. Other documents. Under both the self-directed services and traditional models, the person-centered plan can also include several other documents to demonstrate needs, plans, and strategies to support health and behavior challenges, and service implementation plans with vendors and providers, such as daily schedules, behavior support plans, nursing care plans, professional assessments, and service implementation plans. More information about these documents can be found in the Person-Centered Plan Manual and DDA policies. The DDA provides opportunity for the participant to request an exception to family members working over 40 hours per week through the Family and Staff Overtime Request Form and employee reasonable and customary rates through the wage exception form. The participant's coordinator of community services completes both forms with supporting documentation provided by the team. Requesting family members to work overtime. Participants may request authorization for family members to work overtime. The Family and Staff Overtime Request Form is used to make the request. This form allows participants who self-direct their services to request family members to temporarily work overtime. Participants who self-direct their services are responsible for ensuring that overtime work does not overutilize funds or units in their self-directed services budget. Overtime pay may significantly affect budget utilization. The DDA approves two types of family member overtime request. Brief requests are for 14 days or less. Examples include due to serious inclement weather, sickness of the participant, sickness of another employee, or other important reasons as reviewed and determined by the DDA. And temporary requests are for 15 to 90 days due to sudden notification of an employee's resignation, sudden notification of an employee's death, sudden notification of an employee's intention to use unpaid leave, emergency termination of an employee due to fraud, waste, or abuse, inability to hire employees, and other important reasons as reviewed and determined by the DDA. The overtime request must include an explanation of the request in detail, the schedule for the employee, an explanation of how the participant has a risk to their health or safety without the approved overtime, and documentation must be provided with the form to show the need for the request. This and the following slides show the standards for approval for family overtime request. For serious inclement weather, requires documentation proving inclement weather alerts for the dates requested. Sickness of the participant requires documentation from a medical professional noting the illness of the participant. Sickness of another employee requires documentation from a medical professional noting the illness of the employee. The other category requires supporting documentation that will be reviewed by the DDA. Sudden notification of an employee's resignation requires a letter signed by the employee with the date of resignation noted. Sudden notification of an employee's death requires a dated obituary or signed attestation from the participant. Sudden notification of an employee's intention to use unpaid leave requires a letter signed by the employee requesting dates to use unpaid leave. Emergency termination of an employee due to fraud, waste, or abuse requires documentation of an incident report filed regarding alleged fraud, waste, or abuse, or a letter signed by the employer with the date of termination. Inability to hire employees requires documentation that the job position in question was advertised for 3 previous months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the previous 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended or that the applicants did not meet the written requirements of the job description. And the other category requires supporting documentation that will be reviewed by the DDA. Requesting wage exceptions. Participants with the support of their team can request an exception to the DDA reasonable and customary staff wage range standard, up to the DDA's published exception rate. The participant's coordinator of community services must complete all wage exception forms. One form must be completed for each job position as needed. The wage exception form must include the participant's LTSS ID, the participant's name, the waiver service the employee provides, the participant's county of residence, the proposed wage for the employee's name as applicable, a notation if the employee is a family member, and at least one reason for the wage exception must be chosen. At least one reason for the wage exception must be chosen from the following: lack of available workforce, intensity of the participant's behavioral or health support, uncommon hours or schedule, expectation of short duration of employment, history of high staff turnover, employee certifications or specialized training, employee's years of experience, employee's longevity with the participant, or other. Supporting documentation for the reasons must be uploaded with the request. We will review exactly what documentation is required for an approval in the next slides. If the wage exception request is associated with the lack of available workforce, the following is required: documentation that the job position in question was advertised for the previous 3 months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended, or the applicants did not meet the written requirements of the job description, or the applicant refused to accept the offer within the reasonable and customary range. If the wage exception request is associated with the intensity of the participant's behavior or health support, the following is required: documentation that the job position in question was advertised for the previous 3 months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the previous 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended, or that the applicants did not meet the written requirements of the job description, or the applicant refused to accept the offer within the reasonable and customary range, and documentation of an HRST score of 4 or higher, and documentation of a behavior support plan or a nursing care plan that documents the support needs. If the wage exception request is associated with uncommon hours or schedule, the following is required: documentation that the job position in question was advertised for the previous 3 months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the previous 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended, or the applicants did not meet the requirements of the job description, or the applicant refused to accept the offer within the reasonable and customary range, and documentation of the uncommon hours or schedule for the position. If the wage exception request is associated with the expectation of short duration of employment, the following is required. Documentation that the job position in question was advertised for the previous 3 months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the previous 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended, or the applicants did not meet the written requirements of the job description, or the applicant refused to accept the offer within the reasonable and customary range, and written attestation that the employer plans to employ the employee for no more than 30 days. If the request is associated with a history of high staff turnover, the following is required. Documentation that the position has had 3 or more employees in the same position in the past 365 days, and documentation that shows each of the employees resigned or were terminated with documented cause. If the wage exception request is associated with employee possession of certifications, the following is required. Documentation that the job position in question was advertised for the previous 3 months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the previous 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended, or the applicants did not meet the written requirements of the job description, or the applicant refused to accept the offer within the reasonable and customary range. And a copy of certifications is required for the position, and documentation of 2 job advertisements in Maryland, which are unrelated to the Self-Directed Services Program, are posted within 365 days of the request, and require the certification listed with a pay rate at or above the requested rate. Note: first aid, cardiopulmonary resuscitation or CPR, or any other waiver required certification does not meet the qualifications for a wage exception. If the request is associated with the employee possession of specialized training, the following is required. Documentation that the job position in question was advertised for the previous 3 months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the previous 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended, or that the applicants did not meet the written requirements of the job description, or the applicant refused to accept the offer within the reasonable and customary range, and documentation of the employee specialization, and documentation of 2 job advertisements in Maryland, which are unrelated to the Self-Directed Services Program, are posted within 365 days of the request, and require the specialization listed with a pay rate at or above the requested rate. If the wage exception request is associated with the employee's years of experience, the following is required. Documentation that the job description in question was advertised for the previous 3 months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the previous 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended, or that the applicants did not meet the written requirements of the job description, or the applicant refused to accept the offer within the reasonable and customary range, and a copy of the employee's resume or curriculum vitae, CV, that documents at least 10 years of experience directly related to the service provided to the participant. If the wage exception request is associated with the employee's longevity with the participant, the following is required. Documentation that the position in question was advertised for the previous 3 months, and documentation that at least 5 interviews for the position occurred in the previous 3 months, and documentation that the interviews were not attended or that the applicants did not meet the written requirements of the job description, and documentation that the employee has been employed by or for the employer for a cumulative of at least 8 years, shown by employment records as obtained by the participant's financial management and counseling services provider, or a copy of a new hire letter with a date, or written attestation of employment which involved regular direct contact with the participant while employed by a DDA provider in the traditional model, or written attestation of employment which involved regular direct contact with the participant while employed by a school the participant attended. The DDA offers other reason in the form and will review these requests on a case-by-case basis. All wage exception forms that do not meet the listed standards will be denied and returned to the participant with appeal rights. This and the next slide have useful resources. Summary. Required forms for all participants self-directing their services include Participants' Rights and Responsibilities Form, which notifies participants of their rights and responsibilities. Participant Agreement Form, which documents a participant's request for assistance in self-direction. And the Family of Staff Form, which documents a participant's desire to hire or not hire relatives as employees. Other forms can be used to request exceptions to the self-directed services standards, including the Family Overtime Request Form, which is used to request a family member employee to work over 40 hours a week for a determined period of time, and the Wage Exception Form, which is used to request a higher wage for an employee above the reasonable and customary rate. These forms are submitted by the Coordinator of Community Services and require documentation to be provided in order to be approved. This ends Module 9.